In the suffocating darkness of a basement prison, where hope goes to die, where men lose their names and become numbers, where the echo of footsteps above means another interrogation, another beating, another day stolen from life itself, something extraordinary happened. I, Ahmed Hassan, devoted son of an imam, keeper of Islamic prayers since childhood, guardian of my father's faith, entered that darkness as one person. 14 months later, when bombs cracked the walls and chaos gave me freedom, I emerged as someone entirely different. The Ahmed who walked into captivity carried generations of Muslim tradition in his heart. I knew the Quran by memory, led prayers in my father's mosque, taught children the beauty of Islamic devotion. My faith was unshakable, passed down like precious inheritance from father to son, grandmother to granddaughter, through centuries of Syrian Muslim families who held their beliefs as tightly as they held their children. But faith, real faith, lives in the space between certainty and surrender. In that underground prison, surrounded by men from different worlds, different gods, different definitions of salvation, I discovered that everything I thought I knew about God was about to be tested in ways that would shatter not just my beliefs, but my very identity. The man who entered that basement was prepared to die a martyr for Islam. The man who escaped would choose exile over his homeland, loneliness over family, the unknown over everything familiar, all for a truth that arrived through the most impossible messenger in the most impossible place. I thought I would die as the person I was born to be. I never imagined I would be reborn. This is my story, a journey that reveals how the deepest transformations often happen in the deepest darkness, how faith can become the very thing that leads us away from everything we once called faith, and how sometimes losing everything you believed is the only way to find everything you never knew you needed. If this testimony touches your heart, please subscribe to this channel, share this video with everyone you know, and comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps us reach more people who desperately need hope. I was born Ahmed Hassan in 1985 in Aleppo, into a family where faith wasn't just practiced, it was breathed. My father, Imam Hassan, led prayers at the Al-Noor Mosque on Damascus Street, and my mother Khadija taught Islamic studies at the local elementary school. Every morning I woke to the sound of my father's voice reciting far prayers. Every evening I fell asleep to the gentle murmur of Quran verses floating through our small apartment above his electronics shop. I had two younger sisters, Fatima and Zara, and we were raised in a home where Islam shaped every decision, every conversation, every dream for the future. My father began teaching me Arabic before I could properly hold a pencil, and by age 7, I was already memorizing passages from the Quran that most adults struggled to understand. The other children in our neighborhood called me Little Imam because I would gather them for prayers when the adults were busy, leading them through the motions I had watched my father perform thousands of times. Our family was middle class, respected in the community, completely devoted to living as Allah commanded. My father's shop sold radios and televisions, but he refused to stock anything that played music he considered inappropriate, anything that might lead the faithful away from righteous paths. My mother wore a hijab with pride, taught me that modesty and devotion were the highest virtues, that our family's reputation in the mosque community was more valuable than any worldly success. My childhood was filled with the rhythm of Islamic practice. I learned to perform ablutions before I learned to tie my shoes. I memorized the 99 names of Allah before I memorized my multiplication tables. Every Friday, I would sit in the front row of the mosque, watching my father deliver sermons to hundreds of worshippers, feeling proud that this respected man, this pillar of our community, was my father. After prayers, congregants would approach him for advice about marriage, business, child-rearing, and I would listen carefully, understanding that this was my future, that someday I would carry on his legacy of spiritual leadership. By the time I reached high school, I was already assistant youth leader at the mosque, teaching Quran classes to children younger than myself, leading discussion groups about Islamic ethics and theology. I could recite entire chapters from memory while walking to school, while solving math problems, while helping my father in his electronics shop. The Quran wasn't just a book I read, it was a living presence in my mind, shaping every thought, every decision, every interaction with the world around me. My teenage years were devoted to deepening my understanding of Islamic scholarship. I studied the hadith collections, learned about the different schools of Islamic jurisprudence, memorized hundreds of verses that dealt with every aspect of human behavior. While my classmates were interested in sports and music and the usual distractions of adolescence, I was fascinated by theological questions, by the intricate beauty of Islamic law, by the way faith could provide answers to every conceivable human dilemma. By the time I reached university to study engineering, I was already teaching younger children at the mosque, leading youth groups and helping my father with Friday sermons. Islam wasn't just my religion. It was my identity, my future, my unshakable foundation. I prayed 5 times daily without fail, fasted during Ramadan with genuine joy, and gave zakat with a grateful heart. The Quran lived in my memory so completely that I could recite entire chapters while walking to class, while solving engineering problems, while falling asleep at night. I was engaged to Amira, a girl from our neighborhood whose family had known mine since childhood. We had been promised to each other since we were teenagers, and our planned marriage represented everything beautiful about Islamic tradition, about the way faith and culture and family intertwine to create stable, meaningful lives. We planned a traditional Islamic wedding, a life of devotion, children who would grow up as I had grown up, surrounded by the beautiful certainty of faith passed down through generations. My biggest worry was passing calculus, not survival. My greatest fear was disappointing my father by forgetting a verse during Friday prayers, not losing everything I had ever believed about God. I lived in a world where faith provided answers to every question, where tradition offered solutions to every problem, where the future was as certain and reliable as the past. I had no idea that within 2 years, everything I believed about God, family, and identity would be shattered and rebuilt in ways I could never have imagined. Then in 2011, war came to Syria like a thief in the night, slowly at first, then all at once. We heard the stories from Damascus, from other cities, but Aleppo felt safe, insulated, protected by our prayers and our peaceful lives. My father counseled patience, faith, trust in Allah's plan. We stayed because we believed God would shelter the righteous, because we couldn't imagine leaving the mosque where 3 generations of our family had worshipped, because Syria was not just our country but our identity. The fighting crept closer month by month, street by street, until suddenly it was in our neighborhood, in our lives, in our nightmares. The sound of gunfire became as familiar as the call to prayer. The electricity went out for days at a time. My father's shop was looted twice, and still we stayed, still we prayed, still we believed that faithfulness would be rewarded with protection. My father increased our prayer sessions, organized community fasting days, convinced that increased devotion would bring divine intervention. The mosque became a refuge center, feeding displaced families, housing those whose homes had been destroyed. I spent every spare moment helping coordinate relief efforts, distributing food, and comforting children who had witnessed horrors no child should see. My engineering studies became secondary to survival, but my faith remained strong. If anything, the crisis strengthened my belief that Allah was testing our community, preparing us for greater service, allowing us to demonstrate our loyalty under pressure. On December 15, 2013, my sister Zara was injured when a shell fragment cut her leg while she was collecting water from the communal well. The wound was deep, infected, and she needed antibiotics that we couldn't find anywhere in our devastated neighborhood. The local hospital had been bombed weeks earlier. The few remaining doctors worked out of basements with minimal supplies. She was developing a fever, and we knew that without proper medicine, she could die from an infection that would have been easily treatable before the war. I volunteered to travel to the Eastern District where a pharmacy was rumored to still have medical supplies. It was a journey I had made dozens of times before the war, a simple 20-minute walk through streets I had known since childhood. I kissed my mother goodbye, promised my father I would be careful, and told Zara I would bring back medicine that would heal her leg. I carried my identification papers, money we had hidden in case of emergency, and a prayer that Allah would protect me on this mission of mercy. I never made it to the pharmacy, 3 blocks from our apartment. As I was walking down a street that had once housed my favorite bakery, men with weapons surrounded me. They wore mismatched military uniforms, carried assault rifles, and spoke with accents that suggested they weren't local to Aleppo. They demanded to see identification, accused me of being a government informant because I was educated, because my father was an imam, because I carried myself with the confidence of someone who had never learned to fear authority. When I showed them my university identification, they became more suspicious, not less. An engineering student, they said, someone with technical knowledge who could help the government build weapons or fortifications. When I explained that I was simply trying to find medicine for my injured sister, they laughed. When I told them my father was an imam at the local mosque, they accused me of lying. To them, I was a potential asset or threat, not a human being with a family depending on his safe return. They threw me into the back of a truck with 2 other men I didn't recognize, drove us through parts of the city I had never seen, past checkpoints and barriers and burnt-out buildings that looked like scenes from the apocalypse. The ride lasted maybe 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. None of us spoke. We were all trying to understand what was happening, trying to convince ourselves that this was a misunderstanding that would be resolved quickly, that we would soon be released to return to our families. The truck stopped at a building I had passed countless times but never noticed, a nondescript concrete structure that looked like a small office or warehouse. They pushed us down concrete steps into a basement that smelled like fear and human waste and hopelessness. The basement held 12 men when I arrived, ranging in age from teenagers to grandfathers, representing every sect of Syrian society. There were Sunni and Shia Muslims, Christian Orthodox and Catholic, even one man who claimed no religion at all. We were crowded into a space meant for storage, not human beings, with 1 bucket for waste, 1 bucket for water that was refilled irregularly, bread and thin soup delivered sporadically by guards who seemed to enjoy our degradation. The floor was concrete, cold and unforgiving. There were no beds, no blankets, no privacy. We slept pressed against each other for warmth, woke up to the sound of boots on the stairs above, never knowing whether the footsteps meant food, interrogation, or something worse. I was prisoner number 13, and within hours I understood that my captors didn't actually care whether I was a government sympathizer or not. They cared about power, about control, about having human beings they could break for entertainment. The interrogations were theatrical performances designed to justify their cruelty rather than gather genuine information. They asked the same questions repeatedly, ignored our answers, beat us for sport rather than punishment. The questions never made sense. They wanted to know about government connections I didn't have, about military information I had never possessed, about political activities I had never engaged in. When I told them I was just a student trying to help his injured sister, they accused me of lying. When I recited verses from the Quran to prove my devotion to God, they said I was performing, trying to manipulate them. When I remained silent, they said my silence proved my guilt. For the first months of captivity, my faith actually grew stronger. I led the other prisoners in prayers, shared verses from the Quran that I had memorized in my childhood, and reminded everyone that Allah tests those He loves most deeply. When the guards heard me praying in Arabic, they would sometimes beat me extra hard, calling me a terrorist, a radical, accusing me of plotting against them even in my worship. But the beatings only convinced me that I was being persecuted for my righteousness, that my suffering had spiritual meaning, that Allah was preparing me for some greater purpose. I prayed constantly, begging for rescue, for understanding, for strength to endure. I recited every verse about patience and perseverance, every story about prophets who had suffered and been rewarded, every promise about how the faithful would be delivered from their enemies. I organized the other prisoners into informal prayer groups, trying to maintain dignity and hope in conditions designed to destroy both. When someone despaired, I reminded them of Job's trials. When someone lost faith, I recited passages about how Allah's love sometimes appears as hardship. The other Muslim prisoners looked to me for spiritual leadership. I became their unofficial imam, leading them through daily prayers even when the guards punished us for gathering together. I shared the few verses of comfort I could remember, reminded them that martyrdom was the highest honor a Muslim could achieve, that our suffering would be rewarded in paradise. I truly believed that our captivity was a test of faith, that Allah was watching our endurance, that our faithfulness under pressure would earn us special places in heaven. But as weeks turned to months, as my prayers seemed to bounce off the concrete ceiling and disappear into silence. As my body grew weaker and my mind more desperate, doubt began creeping into the corners of my devotion. 8 months into captivity, I found myself asking questions that would have horrified my father, questions that felt like betrayal of everything I had been taught. If Allah loved me, why was I forgotten? If Islam was the true path, why did my prayers feel like they were addressed to empty air? If my faith was real, why did it seem to be abandoning me when I needed it most? By the 10th month, my prayers had become mechanical recitations, empty sounds I made because habit demanded it, not because I believed anyone was listening. I still led the others in worship because they needed leadership, because the routine provided structure in chaos, but privately I was wrestling with a terrible possibility. What if everything I had believed about God was wrong? What if the faith that had shaped my entire identity was just beautiful stories told by desperate people trying to make sense of a senseless world? The doubt was eating me alive. I would lie awake at night, surrounded by the sounds of grown men trying not to weep, questioning everything my father had taught me, everything I had taught others, everything I had built my life upon. The Quran verses that had once brought comfort now felt like empty poetry. The promises of divine rescue that had sustained me for months now seemed like cruel fantasies designed to make unbearable situations bearable. Then in month 11, guards brought in a new prisoner, and everything changed. His name was Michael, a Syrian Christian from the old quarter of Damascus, maybe 40 years old, with graying hair and hands that shook from whatever torture he had endured before arriving in our basement. The Muslim prisoners were suspicious of him immediately. We had been taught to respect Christians as people of the book, but also to pity them for missing the final revelation, for following a religion that had been superseded by Islam. In our current circumstances, with tensions high and survival instincts raw, religious differences felt dangerous. But Michael was different from any Christian I had ever encountered. He didn't complain about the conditions, didn't curse our captors, didn't seem to expect special treatment or sympathy. When the guards brought our meager daily bread, he would break off pieces of his own portion and quietly offer them to whoever looked weakest that day. When new prisoners arrived terrified and disoriented, he would make space for them in our overcrowded corner, share his thin blanket, whisper words of comfort I couldn't quite hear. Most surprisingly, he prayed for our captors. Every night, after the lights went out and the basement filled with the sounds of grown men trying not to weep, I would hear him whispering prayers in Arabic and sometimes in what I later learned was Aramaic. But these weren't prayers for rescue or revenge or even survival. They were prayers asking God to forgive the men who tortured us, to soften their hearts, to help them find peace. The first time I realized what he was doing, I thought he had lost his mind. How could anyone pray for the people who were slowly killing us? I began watching him more carefully, trying to understand where this impossible peace came from. When guards singled him out for extra beatings because of his religion, he would return to our corner bruised but somehow unbroken, never bitter, never plotting revenge, never losing the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside him. When other prisoners cursed God or declared that religion was useless in our situation, Michael would listen without judgment, sometimes offering gentle words, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence with whoever was suffering most. Late at night, when insomnia kept us both awake, we began having whispered conversations about faith, about God, about how to make sense of suffering. I told him about my Islamic upbringing, about how I had memorized the Quran, about how my prayers had gradually become empty. He listened without trying to argue or convert or prove me wrong. Instead, he shared stories about Jesus that I had never heard properly explained, stories about a God who chose to experience human suffering rather than remain distant from it. He told me that Jesus didn't suffer because God was testing him or punishing him or preparing him for greater glory. Jesus suffered because love required it, because saving humanity meant entering fully into human pain and brokenness and death. This was completely different from anything I had been taught about how God related to suffering. In Islam, Allah is transcendent, perfect, removed from the messy realities of human weakness. But Michael described a God who voluntarily became weak, who chose suffering as an expression of love rather than as a tool for teaching lessons. The most powerful thing about Michael's faith wasn't his theology but his peace. Even in that hellhole, surrounded by cruelty and desperation and the constant threat of death, he possessed something I had never seen before, something that made no logical sense but was undeniably real. He slept better than the rest of us. He shared his food without resentment. He treated our captors with a dignity they didn't deserve and hadn't earned. When I asked him how he maintained hope, he said Jesus had already walked through the valley of death, had already experienced abandonment and torture and crucifixion, which meant we were never truly alone in our suffering. I started listening more carefully to his prayers, comparing them to my own increasingly desperate supplications to Allah. Michael's prayers sounded like conversations with someone he actually knew, someone he trusted completely even when circumstances suggested that trust was foolish. My prayers had become formal recitations, beautiful language addressed to a distant deity who seemed uninterested in responding. But Michael prayed like he was talking to a friend who was sitting right beside him in the darkness, invisible but undeniably present. Over the following months, Michael shared more of his faith with me, not through preaching or arguing, but through quiet conversations that helped pass the endless hours of captivity. He told me about Jesus healing the sick, raising the dead, forgiving sins that seemed unforgivable. He explained how Jesus called God his Father, claimed divine authority, and promised eternal life to anyone who believed in him. These weren't the sanitized stories I had heard in Islamic teaching, where Jesus was portrayed as just another prophet preparing the way for Muhammad. Michael described a Jesus who claimed to be God incarnate, who said things like, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and before Abraham was, I am." He told me about the crucifixion not as a defeat but as a victory, a voluntary sacrifice that paid the price for human sin. He explained resurrection not as a metaphor but as a historical reality that proved Jesus' claims about his divine nature. This was theology that would have been considered blasphemous in my Islamic upbringing, but in our basement prison, surrounded by evidence of human evil and suffering, it began to make sense in ways I couldn't ignore. After 14 months in captivity, bombing destroyed part of our prison building, creating enough chaos for several of us to escape through collapsed walls and abandoned guard posts. I ran through streets I barely recognized, my body weak from malnutrition, my mind reeling from suddenly being free. Michael and I were separated in the chaos, and I never saw him again, though I have never stopped praying for his safety and thanking God for the way he changed my life through his witness in that dark place. I made it back to what remained of my family's neighborhood, found my parents and sisters alive but changed by their own suffering, tried to slip back into the life I had left behind over a year earlier. The reunion was emotional, overwhelming, filled with tears and gratitude and prayers of thanksgiving. My family had assumed I was dead. They had mourned me, held memorial services, and accepted that they would never see me again. My sudden return felt like resurrection, like answered prayer, like proof that Allah had been protecting me all along. But I couldn't do it. The prayers that had once been my lifeline felt foreign in my mouth. The mosque where I had worshipped since childhood seemed strange and empty. My father's sermons about Allah's mercy and justice sounded like beautiful poetry written in a language I no longer fully understood. I went through the motions of being a devout Muslim because I didn't know how to be anything else, but privately I was haunted by questions that wouldn't leave me alone, memories of Michael's impossible peace, doubts about everything I had once held sacred. My family knew something was wrong. My father pulled me aside repeatedly, trying to understand why his formerly devout son seemed disconnected from the faith that had sustained our family through generations of hardship. My mother, worried that the trauma of captivity had damaged my relationship with Allah, suggested extra prayers, fasting, meditation on Quranic verses about healing and restoration. My sisters watched me with concerned eyes, wondering why their brother, who used to lead family prayers, now seemed to be going through empty motions. I couldn't tell them what was really happening inside me. I couldn't explain that I had started questioning not just specific Islamic teachings but the entire foundation of my religious worldview. I couldn't describe how Michael's gentle confidence had planted seeds of doubt about everything I had been taught about Christianity, about who Jesus really was, about whether the religion I had been raised to see as incomplete and superseded might actually contain truths I had never been allowed to consider. For months I struggled in secret, reading forbidden books when my family was asleep, meeting quietly with Christian contacts I found through underground networks, wrestling with questions that felt like betrayal of my father's love and sacrifice. I read the New Testament for the first time in my life, discovering that the Jesus described in those pages bore little resemblance to the limited prophet I had been taught about in Islamic theology. This Jesus claimed to be God incarnate, claimed to offer forgiveness directly, claimed to have conquered death itself through resurrection. Every page of the Christian scriptures seemed written specifically for my pain, my questions, my desperate need for hope that made sense in a world full of senseless suffering. The stories of Jesus healing broken people, forgiving outcasts, offering peace to those tormented by guilt and shame, promising eternal life to anyone willing to accept it as a gift rather than earn it through perfect obedience. These stories spoke to parts of my soul that Islamic teaching had never quite reached. The Gospel of John became particularly meaningful to me. When Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," I remembered the darkness of that basement prison and how Michael had somehow carried light into that terrible place. When Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest," I felt like he was speaking directly to my exhausted soul, offering the kind of rest that sleep couldn't provide, the peace that Michael had demonstrated even under torture. But accepting Christian faith meant abandoning not just a religion but an entire identity, not just changing my beliefs but betraying my family, my community, my culture, everything that had made me who I was for 29 years. I spent sleepless nights weighing the cost, knowing that conversion would mean losing my parents' respect, my sister's love, my place in the only community I had ever known. In Syria, leaving Islam wasn't just changing religions. It was becoming a stranger to your own life. The decision came not in a moment of dramatic revelation but through gradual recognition that I was already no longer the Muslim my family wanted me to be. I had already lost my ability to pray with genuine faith to Allah. I had already started believing that Jesus was more than a prophet. I had already begun hoping for a kind of salvation that Islam couldn't provide. The only question was whether I would acknowledge these changes publicly or continue living a lie that was slowly destroying me from the inside. One night in late 2015, alone in my room while my family slept, I prayed to Jesus for the first time in my life. Not as a prophet, not as a teacher, but as the Son of God who had died for my sins and risen to offer me forgiveness and eternal life. I asked him to save me from the emptiness that Islamic prayer could no longer fill, to heal the brokenness that 2 years of trying to return to my old faith had only made worse, to give me the peace that I had witnessed in Michael even in the midst of torture and hopelessness. The change wasn't dramatic or mystical, but it was real. I felt forgiven not just by God but by myself, for the first time since captivity. I felt connected to something larger than my own suffering, something that made sense of pain without requiring me to pretend it wasn't devastating. I felt hope that didn't depend on my circumstances improving or my prayers being answered in specific ways. It was the kind of peace that Michael had carried in that basement, the peace that passes understanding because it exists independently of whether life makes logical sense. But peace came with a price that nearly broke me. When I finally told my family about my conversion to Christianity, my father wept like I had died. My mother alternated between rage and desperate attempts to convince me I was suffering from mental illness caused by trauma. My sisters begged me to reconsider, to see a therapist, to pray harder to Allah for healing from whatever madness had possessed me. The imam at our mosque declared me apostate. Neighbors who had known me since childhood began treating me like a stranger, a traitor, a cautionary tale about what happens when young people abandon their roots. I tried to explain that I wasn't rejecting them or our culture or the beauty of Islamic tradition. I tried to tell them that the same God they worshipped as Allah had revealed himself more fully through Jesus, that my conversion was the fulfillment of my Islamic faith rather than its betrayal. But they couldn't hear past their own grief and shock and fear for my eternal soul. To them, I had chosen hell over heaven, had thrown away my identity for foreign religion, and had broken their hearts for the sake of beliefs they considered dangerous delusions. The threats began within weeks. Anonymous messages warning me to recant or face consequences. Former friends suggesting that apostates deserved whatever violence befell them. Community leaders made it clear that I was no longer welcome in the neighborhood where my family had lived for generations. I realized that staying in Syria meant not just social isolation but potentially physical danger, that my conversion had made me a refugee in my own homeland even before I crossed any borders. My engagement to Amira was broken immediately. Her family refused to let her see me, declared that I was no longer suitable for marriage, and treated our broken engagement like a death in the family. The girl I had planned to marry, to build a life with, to raise children with in the Islamic faith, was suddenly forbidden from even speaking to me. I had lost not just my religion and my community, but my future as I had always imagined it. I left Syria in the middle of the night in early 2016, carrying only a backpack with a few clothes, my Syrian passport, and a small New Testament that a Christian contact had given me. I couldn't say goodbye properly to my family because I knew they would try to stop me, would think I was having a breakdown, would call authorities or religious leaders to intervene. I left a letter explaining that I loved them more than my own life but couldn't continue living as someone I was no longer able to be. The journey through Turkey, across the Mediterranean to Greece, then overland to Germany took 3 months and nearly killed me twice. I traveled with other Syrian refugees, but I was carrying a different kind of burden than most of them. They were fleeing war and seeking safety. I was fleeing my entire identity and seeking a place where I could become the person my faith had made me without destroying the people I loved most in the world. I was a refugee twice over, displaced from my country and displaced from my past. In the refugee camps, surrounded by thousands of other displaced Syrians, I had to hide my conversion carefully. Most of my fellow refugees were Muslim, and news of an apostate among them could have made camp life dangerous for me. I learned to pray silently, to keep my Bible hidden, to participate in Islamic prayers when refusing would have drawn unwanted attention. The loneliness was overwhelming. I was surrounded by people who shared my language, my culture, my refugee experience, but I couldn't share the most important thing about who I had become. Germany processed my asylum claim based on religious persecution, recognizing that Christian converts from Islam faced genuine threats in Syria and throughout the Muslim world. I was granted refugee status and eventually settled in Berlin, where I learned German, found work as a translator helping other asylum seekers navigate bureaucracy, and slowly began building a new life around my new faith. I met Anna at a church that specialized in ministering to Middle Eastern refugees. She was volunteering as an interpreter, helping Arabic speakers understand German church services, and we became friends before we became anything more. She understood that I wasn't just a refugee from war but a refugee from my own history, that I had sacrificed family relationships for the sake of beliefs that she shared, that my faith had cost me everything familiar and comfortable about my previous existence. Anna was patient with my journey, understanding that conversion from Islam to Christianity involves not just changing beliefs but rebuilding identity from the ground up. She helped me navigate German culture, learn the language, understand legal procedures, find employment. More importantly, she helped me understand that being a Christian meant more than just believing certain theological propositions. It meant joining a community, living according to Christ's teachings, finding ways to serve others who were struggling as I had struggled. We married in 2018, in a small ceremony attended by our church community and a few other Middle Eastern converts who had become like family to me. My biological family was not present, could not be present, because they still considered my conversion a betrayal too painful to acknowledge. But Anna's family welcomed me completely, treating me not as a refugee or an exotic convert but as their son, their brother, their beloved family member. Now we have a beautiful daughter named Grace, and I work full-time helping other Muslim refugees understand that they have choices, that faith doesn't have to be fear, that questioning inherited beliefs isn't betrayal but courage. I've helped dozens of other converts navigate the same impossible journey I walked, the journey from one faith to another when that transition costs you everything you've ever known about yourself. My father still prays that I'll come home to Islam. I pray that he'll understand I am home. I don't hate Islam or my family or the culture that shaped my childhood. I'm grateful for the foundation of faith they gave me, for the devotion to God they instilled in me, for the moral framework that helped me recognize truth when I encountered it in the most unlikely place. I'm still the same person who memorized the Quran as a child. Now I also know the gospel. I'm still a Syrian who grew up above an electronics shop in Aleppo. Now I'm also the German citizen raising a daughter in Berlin. I'm still the son of Imam Hassan and teacher Khadija. Now I'm also the husband of Anna and father of Grace. Identity isn't replacement. It's addition, layers of truth that accumulate over time until you become someone you never imagined you could be. Suffering can destroy faith or transform it. I chose transformation. I chose hope over despair, love over fear, the unknown over the familiar. I chose Jesus over everything else because he had already chosen me in that basement prison, speaking through Michael's impossible peace, calling me toward a truth that was worth losing everything to gain. This is my family now, built on choice rather than just birth, built on love that crosses every boundary that humans create to separate themselves from each other. Grace will grow up knowing both her father's Islamic heritage and her parents' Christian faith. She'll understand that faith is a journey, not a destination, that God reveals himself in many ways but fully in Jesus Christ. If you're watching this and questioning your own faith, if you're struggling with inherited beliefs that no longer make sense, if you're wrestling with the cost of choosing truth over tradition, know that you're not alone. Know that God meets us in our doubts as surely as he meets us in our certainties. Know that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you've been looking for all your life. The price of following Christ was higher than I ever imagined, but so was the reward. I traded the certainty of tradition for the adventure of truth. I exchanged the comfort of conformity for the challenge of authentic faith. I gave up the security of staying the same for the growth that comes from becoming who God created me to be. Every day I pray for my family in Syria, for their safety, for their hearts to be open to the truth I've discovered, for reconciliation that seems impossible, but that I believe God can accomplish. Every day I'm grateful for Michael, wherever he is, for being Jesus to me when I needed him most. Every day I thank God for Anna and Grace, for the church community that welcomed a broken refugee, for the opportunity to help other seekers find their own path to Christ. Before you go, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel if this testimony touched your heart. Share this video massively with anyone who needs to hear that transformation is possible, that faith can survive the deepest darkness, that God's love crosses every boundary we create. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from around the world. Your support means everything and helps us reach more people who need hope. Together, we can share stories of redemption that remind the world that no one is beyond God's reach. No situation too dark for his light to penetrate. Thank you for listening to my story, and may God bless you wherever you are in your own journey of faith.